Oh, you had Greg. Yeah. But did you have him in person or online? Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, Greg's style of assessment is very different than mine. So it's also a matter of just getting used to the language of these things, which is part of why I do supply and demand again, so that you can see it with this language, see how I want you to practice it. But bottom line, try again after today. If it's still not making sense, do not sweat it. That's what you ask me. All right? Okay. That works. Yeah. How's everybody else doing? Anybody got any questions or concerns? Anything about anything?
Are the problem sets going to be where we can access them?
Yeah, so if you go into Canvas now, I just posted the first one. So if you go into Canvas and you go to assignments, you'll see it there. Also, if you go to modules, you'll see it there.
Okay.
I have it set up into modules so that I can release solutions only to people who turned in the problem set. But you can find it either on assignments or modules. I guess maybe I'll share my screen. So here is what you see. If you go to assignments, then here's problem set 1. I also posted data assignment 1. I'm not going to talk about that for a little bit. And then here's the link to it. Okay. And then if you go to modules, you can see it as well. Now you should see these things as well, which hopefully will be grayed out for you because I have this set so that you have to score at least 1 on this, meaning you have to have turned it in. And then you'll get, those will get released to you.
Okay,
But this will
perfect. Thank
also
you.
let you see it. Yeah. How's that? Anybody else got anything? Okay. Good, Jillian. How was commencement, Jillian? Did anybody go to commencement?
It was actually really good. Um, I think there was more people than was expected because my wife and mother-in-law were saying that they kept having to add more chairs. So,
Oh,
but yeah, it was good.
all right. 6 o'clock. Let's get to it. So, nobody have any questions logistically. So, as far as logistics go, here's what's going on. First problem set is posted. Okay. Um, I have it listed as a due date of the 26th, but again, I want to emphasize that that is a suggestion more than a hard deadline. If you turn it in after that date, I won't penalize you at all. But that is due on the 26th. The next problem set 2, I'll post that sometime next week. That'll be due on the 2nd, and then the exam will be on the 4th. So the exam is 2 weeks from Thursday. Okay, so we'll take that June 2nd day to do a review and stuff like that. Okay. Now data assignment 1 is also listed as a due date of the 2nd, I think. I'm going to talk about that later. Probably maybe on the 26th I'll talk about that. Again, suggested due date of the 2nd, but you can turn it in whenever. Okay. I think what most people are going to end up doing, which I think is pretty good practice, which I think would be a pretty good flow here, is problem set 1, doing it like as soon as possible. Problem set 2 will be due on the 2nd, and I strongly suggest you finish it by the 2nd because then you can see solutions to study for the exam on the 4th. And then after you turn in the exam on the 4th, then you'll have some downtime as we start the next unit, which you can do to get the data assignment done. Okay, I think that would be kind of the optimal way to go through that. All right. Any other logistic questions? I hope that like the logistics are relatively straightforward. I think they are, right? I don't think that they're crazy anything like that, right? No, does anybody have any logistical concerns? Yeah, so people that had me, I'm trying to see. I always forget how many people have me for macro. There's several in here, but like the exams look identical to the problem sets. It's basically going to be 4 questions that I pick from the problem sets, and I change the numbers up a little bit, but it's going to look eerily similar to the problem sets. Okay. So yeah, so problem set 1 and 2 are the entirety of the content that's going to be on the first exam, and it's going to look very similar to those questions from problem set 1 and 2. And I'll just tell you right now that when it comes time to do a review on the second, I will tell you sort of exactly which questions are going to be important for you to know. Okay. Thanks, William. Anything else, or should I get going? So if you have something else, just stop me. So last time we started supply and demand. So we got through demand last time. Demand. Okay. And there's another question. Having not seen them at all, will you be willing to explain what we do wrong? Yeah. So when you submit the problem sets, Maria, I will grade them. And my grading of them, I pick out certain problems that are most important and I grade those, and you will see feedback on those problems. But then once a problem set is graded, you will have access to the solutions that show you exactly how it should have been done. And I'm always more than happy to kind of go into specifics one-on-one if you're not clear. Yeah. Good. All right, so last time we did demand. So demand is the relationship between price and quantity demanded. Okay, and that relationship is given by the law of demand, which basically says that as the price falls, the quantity demanded goes up. Okay, so this is the law of demand, which says that as the price falls from, say, P0 to P1, P0 to P1, then quantity demanded rises from QD0 to QD1. Okay, that's the law of demand. So when the price changes, you move along a given demand curve. But of course, there are many things other than the price that affect quantity demanded. Those are what we call determinants of demand. Okay, and the determinants of demand are, we talked about them last time, but tastes and preferences, okay, the prices of related goods, which if you remember, we had 2 kind of goods, substitutes, and complements. And then we have income. And then if you remember, we have normal and inferior goods. And then lastly, we have number of buyers. And finally, we have expectations. Okay, all of these things affect quantity demanded and are not the price of the good, which means they shift the demand curve to the right or to the left, which is a change in the quantity demanded for every price. Okay, so I talked about these last time. Now, at the very end, we talked about the difference between demand and quantity demanded. Tired. That's another good one. But where is so what does the D stand for? Taste, income, related goods, expectations. That's why we have tribe. So I think you could maybe figure out another acronym, but tribe is, yeah. Okay, so those things will shift demand, change quantity demanded for every price. Okay, so at the end, we talked about the difference between demand and quantity demanded. Quantity demanded is this, a point on the demand curve. Okay, demand is this, the relationship between price and quantity demanded. Okay, so what changes quantity demanded? The price. When the price falls, quantity demanded goes up. When the price rises, quantity demand goes down. What changes demand? All of this stuff. Okay, so that was basically to say the price does not affect demand. It does not change the relationship between price and quantity demanded. Okay, that's a little bit of I don't want to say being nitpicky, but in a way, it kind of is. It's mainly language, okay? The difference between demand and quantity demanded, okay? Now, we have a similar thing for supply, which I talked about at the end last time. Supply is the relationship between the price and the quantity supplied, okay? So if we draw quantity supplied and the price, then supply follows what we call the law of supply, which says that as the price goes up, so does the quantity supplied, which is completely and utterly obvious, but it is driven by the less obvious phenomenon of increasing marginal costs, which basically mean the only way you would produce the next unit is if the price was higher to compensate for that higher cost, right? We're going to talk way more about that when we talk about the nature of firm production costs, okay? So when the price goes up, it traces you along a supply curve. Now, just like how we had determinants of demand, we have determinants of supply. Now, determinants of supply are motivated by the fact that, yes, okay, there are various things other than the price that affect the amount of a good that producers are willing and able to offer for sale. Okay, so factors other than price affect quantity supplied, and these are called, of course, the determinants of supply. Called determinants of supply. Now, when these things change, the entire supply curve shifts. Okay, when these other factors change, the entire supply curve shifts. The entire supply curve shifts. Now, here's where I want to make a quick point as to what these shifts look like, because with supply, unlike demand, it's a little bit easier to confuse what a shift in supply looks like. So for supply, a shift to the right is an increase in supply. Shift to the right is an increase in supply. And what this means is that at every price, there's a higher quantity demanded. At every price, higher quantity demand. Oh, supplied, sorry. Okay, and then a shift to the left, that's fine, is a decrease in supply, and this means that at every price, there is a lower quantity supplied. Okay, so when we draw what those shifts look like, you can see quantity supplied, price. If we draw a supply curve like this and identify a price on there, let's say P0, call this QS0. If supply goes this way, we call that an increase in supply, right? Because at every price, there's a higher quantity supplied. So this is an increase in supply. Now, a decrease in supply goes like this. Okay, at every price, there is a lower quantity supplied. Does that make sense? It's tempting to think that an increase in supply means going from S0 to S2 because it's higher. But no, that's not what that means. An increase in supply is always referring to the quantity axis. So if supply goes up, then it needs to increase on the quantity axis. Zoom out a little. Okay. Does that make sense what an increase in supply and a decrease in supply look like? Good. Okay. So let's see here. With that said, then we can talk about what these things are. What are these shifters? What are these other factors that are being tucked away under ceteris paribus for a given supply curve? Okay. And those are going to be, let's see here, determinants of supply. Okay. The first is resource and input prices. Maybe I'll do the same numbers as I did last time. So first, we have resource and input prices. Okay, being that if resource and input prices rise, then supply is going to shift to the left. Okay. At every price now, with the higher input prices, there are fewer units that are profitable to produce. Right? A firm is always going to produce all the units that are profitable to make. At a given price, they're going to make all the units that increase their profit. If input prices go up, then there are going to be fewer units that increase their profit, right? Because their costs are higher, which means supply is going to shift to the left. I think that's kind of clear, right? Which is to say, for example, if wages go up, then supply is going to shift to the left. Okay. If you are a bread manufacturer and the price of yeast goes up, then supply is going to shift to the left. If you make tires and the price of rubber goes up, then supply shifts to the left. Okay. If you're a farmer and land prices go up, then supply is going to shift to the left. Okay. I think that's pretty clear, right? Now, the second thing that shifts supply is other goods. Other goods. Now, this one, I call it other goods mainly because it fits the acronym, okay? But the idea here is that some firms produce goods that can be easily substituted between one another, okay? So for me, the classic example is like a firm that makes soccer balls or basketballs, right? So suppose that you have technology that's really good at taking some material like leather, shaping it into a ball and inflating it. Presumably, you could make either soccer balls or basketballs. So if the price of soccer balls skyrockets, you're going to want to make more soccer balls, so you're going to use less of your equipment to make basketballs. So the supply of basketballs is going to go down, right? So when the price of these other goods, increases, then supply for whatever the given good is going to decrease. Okay? Now, 3, we have technology. Okay. Technology is something that effectively allows you to get more output for a given amount of input, right? So with the assembly line, Henry Ford figured out the assembly line and he realized, oh, I can get more cars for a given amount of labor. That means the cost of producing one car has fallen because now it's going to take less labor to do it, right? So as a result, now there's going to be more units that are profitable for the firm to produce with the lower production costs, and so supply is going to shift to the right, right? So if technology improves, then supply is going to increase. I think that makes sense, right? Okay. 2 more. 3 more. Next, we have taxes and subsidies. Okay. Taxes, we all know what taxes are, right? The government might charge a firm for producing a unit of a good. Now, we're going to see taxes extensively when we talk about elasticity here in the next couple of weeks. And then we're going to see taxes later when we talk about externalities like pollution. Okay. So the effect of taxes on supply are super important. Basically, if taxes are imposed on a good, then it increases production costs, right? There's going to be fewer units that are profitable for the firm to produce, and therefore supply is going to shift to the left. So if taxes increase, then supply is going to decrease. Now, a subsidy is a reverse tax. So the government pays a firm for production of every unit of a good. So if subsidies go up, now there are going to be more units that are profitable to produce, so supply goes up. Okay. 2 more things. 5, we have expectations. Expectations affect both supply and demand, right? If a buyer expects the price of something to go up in the future, then they're going to want to buy more of it now. Demand's going to go up. If a seller expects the price to go up in the future, then they're going to wait to sell that thing until the price goes up, right? So if you're thinking about selling your home, right, and it's January, and you think, okay, the price of homes are going to go up in the summer when everyone's looking for a home, then I'm going to wait until the summer to sell my home, and as a result, supply is going to go down right now. Okay, so expectations work in a similar way with demand, but if the price of a good is expected to rise, then supply for that good is going to decrease, right? Okay, last but not least, we have the number of sellers. Okay. If there are more sellers in a market, if the number of sellers rises, then of course supply goes up. All right. So there you have it. Those are the things that shift supply. Questions? Good?
Good.
Okay, sweet. Okay, so I need to make a similar disclaimer here, even though you've already seen this spiel, so I'm gonna sound like a broken record. But again, just like there's a difference between demand and quantity demanded, there's a difference between supply and quantity supplied. Okay, it's exactly analogous, right? Quantity supplied is a point on the supply curve. Supply is the entire supply curve. Okay, so supply versus quantity supplied. Okay, same disclaimer as I had before. Quantity supplied is the amount that producers are willing and able to offer for sale at a particular price. Okay, which is to say it is a single point on the supply curve. A point on the supply curve. Okay. Now, quantity supplied is going to change when the price of that product changes, and it's going to move you along a given supply curve. So quantity supplied changes when the price of that product changes. When the price of that product changes. Okay, so this is a movement along a given supply curve, right? So I've already drawn this, but quantity supplied, price, supply. So quantity supplied is referring to this amount that producers want to offer for sale at a price of P0. So if the price rises to P1, that is going to move you along a given supply curve and induce a change in quantity supplied.
Sorry, would you be able to slide the screen down a tiny bit, please?
Yeah. How's that better?
Thank you. Absolutely.
Does
Thank
that
you.
make sense? Okay, so it's the same exact spiel as we had before. Quantity supplied is a point. Supply is the entire thing. Caleb, are you good, or you want me to keep this for a second here?
Yeah, I'm good.
Yeah. No, you're good.
Oh,
You're good.
never
You're good. You're good. You're good. Any questions? I think at this point, right, you probably have a few questions because you've seen this stuff before. Okay. So once we get to the new topics, which we might, I know that Greg doesn't do consumer and producer surplus and macro. So even today, I'll start talking about some new stuff that you haven't seen before. So at that point, you might have more questions. But for now, I think that, everything I'm saying is straightforward. It's just a matter of keeping up with the writing. Okay, good? Okay, thanks, Steve. All right, so now supply then is the entire relationship. Okay. Supply represents the relationship between price and quantity supplied, which means we are referring to the entire supply curve. The entire supply curve. And supply changes when, go ahead, William.
Oh, sorry about that.
You're good. When one of the determinants of supply changes. Okay, so we say that quantity supply changes when the price changes. We say that supply changes when one of these things changes: technology, taxes, expectations, whatever. Okay. So again, I'm going to ask you the question. You can put in the chat or shout it out or whatever. Suppose that we're talking about the market for apples. Okay. So the supply curve for apples. When the price goes up, what happens to the supply of apples? I'll say it again. We're talking about the supply curve for apples, so the market for apples. When the price goes up, when the price of apples goes up, what happens to the supply of apples?
It increases.
I see some different
Goes
answers.
down.
So we got goes up, goes down, nothing. So the answer is nothing. When the price goes up, again, this is an annoying language thing more than anything. When the price goes up, it changes quantity supplied. It moves you along a supply curve, right? It does not change this relationship. So we don't say it changes supply. We say it changes quantity supplied. Does that idea make sense? Yeah. Is it a trick question? Yeah, kind of. It kind of is. Now, I'm never going to ask you on an exam, that exact question, because it is getting into the world of trickiness. And frankly, when people, like, you hear all the time, people say like, oh, the price went up, so supply went up. Like, people say that, right? Like, everybody says that. Like, if you ask a layperson, oh, what happens when the price goes up? They would say supply goes up. Now, economists kind of being annoying are basically saying, no, supply is the relationship. If the price goes up, it just traces you along that curve. It doesn't shift it. You see what I mean? Good? Yeah. Now, the old heads of economics worry way more about this than me. I say it because I feel obligated to, because everybody says it, but again, I'm never gonna ask you this on an exam. I think I put a couple of questions in the problem set, like a couple of trick ones. If you look at, I think that the question 2, there's a question about apples, and I say what happens when the price of apples changes, and the point is nothing to demand. It just changes quantity demanded. Okay. All right. Good. Makes sense. All right. Sweet. Yeah, right. And that's what a lot of people say that economics is, which is just formalizing obvious things. Okay. Yeah. But I think that having clear and consistent language is important, okay? Because quantity supplied means something different than supply, right? It does. Now, to a layperson, they don't really give a shit, because if I say the price goes up, what happens to demand? Well, pretty much every single person you ask, other than people who have taken an economics class and remember, will say that demand goes down. So it's just a matter of making sure our language is consistent, because we need to use the word demand to refer to the curve. Okay? Basically, I've said this before, and I'll say it again. If it's on the axis, it can't shift the curve. That's kind of the main point here, right? Price is on the axis, so it can't shift the curve. It can only move you along the curve. All right? Good? I'll do some examples in a minute. I want to introduce the concept of equilibrium first, and then we'll do some examples. Okay, but you've all seen this before, so we all know where this is going. Apparently, we have a supply curve that's upward sloping. We have a demand curve that's downward sloping. We want to put them on the same graph. Okay, and the intersection is going to mean something. It is going to signify our market equilibrium. So when we say the equilibrium, well, let me just say that supply and demand determine the equilibrium price and, oops, that's an ugly ampersand, and the equilibrium quantity of a good or service of a good. Okay. Now, you've all seen this before, so I'm not really spoiling any incredible, groundbreaking surprise. But you know that what's happening here is you have quantity here, price here. You have a supply curve. Let me make it straight like that. Supply curve that's upward sloping, a demand curve that is downward sloping, like so. And their intersection is going to mean something special. Okay. So the equilibrium price, I'm just going to write EQ. All right, so I don't have to write equilibrium every time. I think you all know equilibrium is just EQ. The equilibrium price, which I'll denote with PE, is defined as the price at which quantity demanded is equal to quantity supplied. Okay, so it is the only, this is an E, by the way. Oh, that's ugly. That's way better. All right. It is the only price at which the amount that consumers want to purchase is equal to the amount that producers want to sell. So perfect amount of McChickens purchased where its value is warranted. Yeah, it's the exact price at which the amount of McChickens I want to buy is equal to the amount of McChickens that McDonald's wants to sell. Exactly. Great example. Okay, and then we say when the price in the market is equal to the equilibrium price, the market is said to be in equilibrium. The market is in equilibrium. Okay, this should remind you that markets do not, I have to make sure that you're very clear on this. When we draw supply and demand and we look at the intersection, okay, we always just write PE there. The market price does not have to be equal to that value. Okay, markets do not have to be in equilibrium. We'll talk more about that in a second. Now, when it is the case that the market is in equilibrium, that happens when the price is equal to PE. Okay, so in other words, the equilibrium price for a McChicken might be $2. If the current price is $1.75, that's totally possible. It just means the market is not in equilibrium. Okay, we'll talk more about that in a second. Now, and the equilibrium quantity is just the quantity that corresponds to this equilibrium price. So I'll denote this with QE. And this is the quantity corresponding to the equilibrium price. Okay, good. Does that make sense? All right, let's do an example with numbers. So above, I gave you, so yesterday, not yesterday, what am I saying? What was it? Thursday, I gave you a demand curve and I told you to graph it. Okay, and then I also gave you a supply curve and I told you to graph it. So let's return to those two. So if demand is given by quantity demanded equals 5 minus P over 2, and supply is given by quantity supplied equals P over 2 minus 1, then let's ask ourselves, what is the equilibrium price and quantity? Okay, take a second to try that. So in the meantime, I'm going to draw it again. So if demand is given by quantity demanded equals 5 minus P over 2, remember, I like to do this by rewriting it to isolate the price. So that's going to be P is equal to 10 minus 2 QD, like that. Okay. And if supply is given by QS equals P over 2 minus 1, then I like to rewrite that to say that P equals 2 plus 2 QS. Okay, so I'm just drawing it. I'm not solving the problem right now. But the reason I'm drawing it is so that we can obviously mark the equilibrium on the graph, because that's the entire point, right? So when we draw demand, we're going to have 10. Let me 10 right here. And supply. Okay. Just drew it. That's all I did. But we have to solve for these numbers now. Does anybody want more time to try it, or are you good for me to show you? If I don't get any answers, I'll show you. Okay, so equilibrium is defined as the point where quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. So we have quantity demanded right here. We have quantity supplied right here. All we have to do is set them equal to each other. Okay, that's it. So the equilibrium is going to have quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. So that's going to give us 5 minus P over 2 equals P over 2 minus 1, like that. Now it's just a matter of solving it. So if we add P over 2 to both sides, that's going to give us basically 5 equals P minus 1. And so P is going to be equal to 6. Okay. So this point here is going to be 6. And then the quantity is going to be, you plug that into either the demand curve or the supply curve. So quantity is going to be 5 minus 6 over 2 equals 5 minus 3, which is 2. Okay, so the answer is PE equals 6, QE equals 2. You get that squared to look good. There we go. How's that? How are we feeling about that? Right, okay. Yeah, drawing a graph is an art form that takes practice. I mean, yeah, I've drawn a million of them, so I just kind of know kind of where it's going, but this is exactly why you practice. Now, I'll say this, which is that notice that this question did not explicitly require you to draw a graph. Can you see that? I drew the graph as something for us to look at, but you did not have to. Okay. What you had to do is this. That's basically what you had to do. Easiest equation to remember. Good. How's that? Fine? Can I move on? Anybody got any questions about that? There's going to be plenty of practice on this exact idea in the problem set. And I'm just going to say this. If you can't do a problem like this, you're screwed. Okay? Because just like William said, this is the easiest equation to remember. Will we need to draw them on exams? If I ask, then yes. I don't think I ask on the exam. I may ask you to draw a general graph of supply and demand. I would say be able to draw them on the exam, but I don't remember if I ask you to draw an exact graph. I'll remind myself when I read the exam again closer to our review day. Fair enough. Yeah. Okay, good. Okay. So let's talk more about the properties of this equilibrium. So the idea here is that markets do not have to always be in equilibrium. So this is our supply and demand, and this is our equilibrium price and quantity. So the equilibrium price is 6. Now, the most important thing to remember about markets is that even though the equilibrium price is 6, okay, the market price or the price in the market at any given time does not have to be equal to 6. Okay, so markets do not have to be in equilibrium. Markets do not have to be in equilibrium. Okay, so if that's the case, then why the hell do we care about equilibrium? If we solve for the equilibrium price and say it's 6, who cares? If the price doesn't have to be 6, then why do we care about that equilibrium price? Anybody? So what I'm telling you is that if you look at this graph of supply and demand, where the equilibrium price is 6, I'm telling you the price in this market does not have to be 6. Then why do we care at all about solving for the equilibrium price? That's the question.
Is it more of like a goal?
You're so close. It's not necessarily a goal as it is something that we are going to naturally move towards.
So like a measured trend or standard?
So it's something that we're always going to be moving towards. Okay. So if the equilibrium price is 6, the price in the market at any given time might be $8. That means that over time, the price is going to fall towards 6. Now, the price might very well also be $4. That's perfectly fine. That would simply mean that the price is going to rise over time. So markets do not always have to be in equilibrium, but they will always move toward equilibrium. Does that idea make sense? So it doesn't have to be the case that we're in equilibrium, but we're always going to be getting closer. Okay, let's see if I can draw a graph right here and use this for the discussion of this. So this is just for the sake of an example. I'm just kind of pulling numbers out of my ass here for this example. Let's say that okay, the equilibrium price is 5. Now, if it is the case that the price is not equal to PE, even with needs, even with needs, the markets do not have to be in equilibrium. Okay, let me. So Maria's question is kind of basically what she's doing is casting doubt on what I said. Let me put it this way: a market is in equilibrium when the quantity demanded is equal to the quantity supplied. Okay, how many times have you gone to the store and found that the exact amount of the good that you want to purchase at the given price is exactly what they have on the shelves? That would be a market in equilibrium. When we go to get gas, there's a ton of gas sitting in those tanks. Clearly, the amount of gas that's being supplied is not equal to what's being purchased. Okay. Or you might go to a store like Target, you really want something and you find that it's not there. That's a market that's not in equilibrium. Right? So I think it's more common for a market to not be in equilibrium than it is for it to be in equilibrium. If a market were to be in equilibrium, then you would go to Target looking for whatever, the newest pair of shoes that you want, and you know you're going to buy one pair of shoes, you go and there's exactly one pair of shoes for you to buy. The exact amount that's been supplied has been purchased. Okay. Now, in reality, you go to Target and what do you find? You find a ton of shoes that are going unsold, or you find that there's none of the shoe that you want. You see what I mean? So it's a lot easier for a market to be out of equilibrium than it is for it to be in equilibrium. Does that make sense? Now, the point here is that if the price is not equal to the equilibrium price, then we say the market is not in equilibrium. The market is not in equilibrium. Now, if a market, so in other words, if you look at this market, let's say this is the market for gas. Okay, $5 a gallon is about what the price of gas is right now. Okay, so suppose that this is the market for gas, $5 a gallon. Now, if the price is not equal to $5 a gallon, then the market's not in equilibrium. Now, in that case, if the market is not in equilibrium, if a market is not in equilibrium, then the behavior of buyers and sellers will move the market toward equilibrium. Okay, so if, for example, we have a situation where the price, okay, if we have a situation where the price exceeds the equilibrium price, so let's say that we're up here. Okay, let's say that this is a price equal to $7. Okay, if the price is greater than the equilibrium price, we call this distance, okay, between the amount that's being supplied at that price and the amount that's being demanded at that price. What do we call this distance between quantity supplied and quantity demanded? Anybody?
Surplus.
Surplus. There is a surplus in the market, okay, because the quantity supplied exceeds the quantity demanded. So this is called a surplus. Now, if a market has a surplus, then what's happening is shelves are piling up. Inventory is piling up and it's going unsold. Okay, what is any sensible company going to do when they see their shelves piling up and nobody buying it? They're going to offer their goods for sale. They're going to put them on a discount. Okay, so if there's a surplus like this, then suppliers lower their price in order to sell off the surplus. The surplus. Okay, and it is then going to move us towards equilibrium. Okay, does that make sense? Good. Now, the opposite happens when the price is lower than equilibrium. So let's see if I can just take this. Everybody following me? No, you're good. You're good. Let me know if you need me to show you something again. Oops. What was that? Yes, but I would like, okay, yeah, that's fine. Well, you just let me know and I'll show you the graphs again. But I'm gonna let me finish doing the that looks stupid, but I think whatever. I don't really care. Okay, now, so we talked about what happens if the price is higher than the equilibrium price. What if the price is lower than the equilibrium price? Okay, so if you have a situation If the price is lower than the equilibrium price, then we have a situation where the price is, say, right here. Let's say that this price is $3. Okay. At this price, I have to change these labels. Okay. At this price, the quantity demanded exceeds the quantity supplied. What do we call that distance?
Shortage.
Yeah. There is a shortage. Very good. Okay. Which is to say that quantity demanded exceeds quantity supplied. So that is a shortage. Okay. Now, in this case, what's going to happen is that being that there's a shortage of the good, there are consumers who were willing to pay more than $3 but did not get the good. Can you see that? So all of these consumers here were willing to pay more than $3, right? Because that the demand curve gives us the willingness to pay. But they did not get the good because only this many people got the good. Okay. Therefore, those consumers who did not get the good but were willing to pay more than that $3 will bid up on the price. Okay. Then consumers, I should say, buyers will bid up on the price. Okay. Being that at the current price, there are some buyers who are willing to pay more than that price, but did not get the good. I know a lot of writing. I'm just putting into writing what I said in words. Okay. When the price is below equilibrium, there's a shortage. Okay. Buyers will bid up on the price because at the current price of $3, there are some buyers who are willing to pay more than that price. Okay. There are buyers who are willing to pay $5 who didn't get the good. They're going to bid up on the price. Now, suppliers are going to take that as a signal that, hold on, we're going to be able to raise our prices a little bit and make a little bit more money. Okay. So as a result of that, prices are going to rise and it's going to move us towards equilibrium. Moving toward equilibrium. Okay. So let's zoom out and look at these graphs. Shortage, yep. Okay, there are the two graphs.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
If the shortage is great enough, could that create a black market for that good?
So black market. I'm thinking about that answer. That's a really good question. Right. I mean, that's kind of basically demand. Well, if you can notice, so I'm kind of going on a tangent to Caleb's question, but if you can notice, I haven't really gotten into this, but like anytime demand goes up, there's a shortage that's created temporarily. Can everybody see that? If demand shifts to the right, then before the price adjusts, there's a shortage. Okay, and that shortage is what puts the price up. That's exactly what happens with, speculation assets like Bitcoin, where demand just keeps going up and up and up, right? Without an increase in supply, the only thing that can happen is that the price goes up. Okay. Now, to Caleb's point, really, black markets are more likely to form when there is a surplus of output that firms cannot sell off. So when we talk about price controls, you will see that if the government imposes a minimum price in that market, it makes it to where firms really want to sell a lot of the good, but consumers don't want to buy them at that price. So the only way they can get those sold is in a lower price on the black market. Okay. Being when there's a shortage, I mean, it's possible that, like we had during COVID, consumers will basically go outside and start paying exorbitant amounts for toilet paper. But the minute that firms see that happening, that's a signal to them to raise the price. So it's not really the firm engaging in the black market sale. Okay. How's that, Caleb? Is that a satisfying answer?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Maybe like concert tickets for popular artists. People pay higher amounts for resale tickets. Yeah. So it's just fear of missing out. I mean, what with the shortage? Yeah, kind of. I mean, it's not. I mean, you could call it that, but really, what it is the fact that you're willing to pay more than the market price, but you can't get the good. Okay, so you actually value it more than it costs, and so you really want the good, and you bid up on the price. Maybe like concert tickets for popular artists. People pay higher amounts for resale tickets. Yeah. Just curious, can't certain laws and stuff mess with all of this? No, laws will mess with all of this. We're going to talk about the laws. I don't know if we're going to get to it today. Maybe. But yeah, laws are going to mess with this. For example, two obvious laws that you can think of are laws that impose a minimum price on the good, okay, or laws that impose a maximum price on the good, right? That basically causes the market to stray away from that equilibrium price and will create surpluses or shortages, as we'll talk about later. Don't tariffs mess with this? Yeah, tariffs do mess with this, although the toolkit that we use to study tariffs is a little bit more complicated, so I don't really get into it all that much. But tariffs have both microeconomic effects and macroeconomic effects depending on the nature of the tariff. I don't really get into it that much, but we can talk if you're curious about it. Okay. Anything else? Good questions. Does the content make sense at this point? Sweet. Okay. Yeah, tariffs, how they're imposed plays a big difference. If it's a blanket tariff on pretty much everything, then we think of that as shifting short run aggregate supply, right? Because our firms that import those things to use in inputs pay higher prices, and so it reduces the profit for firms, right? If it's a tariff on one specific product, we think of that as increasing the world price, and that kind of reduces the amount of trade that happens because it makes domestic producers more competitive. I'm not really going to get into that all much. Okay. All right. So next thing is to say, look, okay. So if the price is above equilibrium, then we know it's going to fall. Okay, that's what we have here. If the price is below equilibrium, oops, can you guys still hear me? Okay. If the price is below equilibrium, then the price is going to rise. Now, once the price reaches that equilibrium value, there is no longer any pressure for it to rise or fall. That's why we call it an equilibrium, because once you get to that point, there's no pressure to deviate from there. Okay, so once a market is in equilibrium, it remains there. It remains there until what? Or supply, right? So it's going to remain there until supply or demand shift, right? So once a market is equilibrium, it remains there until one of the determinants of supply and or demand changes. That gives us a new equilibrium that we start moving towards. Okay, the resulting shifts lead to a new equilibrium price and quantity. Okay, therefore we can use supply and demand, which is really the main point of supply and demand, is using it to predict the effects of these determinants of supply and demand on the equilibrium price and quantity. Okay. Thus, we can use this model to predict how the determinants of supply and demand affect the equilibrium price and quantity. Okay. Okay, and then here's how this goes. So this is kind of a reminder of how this goes. When only one of supply and demand shifts, when one of supply or demand shifts, so when there is only one curve that shifts, we can determine the effect. We can determine the effect on both the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity. Okay, so when one curve shifts, we can make a definitive prediction as to what's going to happen to both the equilibrium price and quantity. Okay, now when both supply and demand shift, when both supply and demand shift, okay, we can only determine the effect on one of PE or QE. Okay, the other is going to be uncertain. How about some examples? I got a couple of chats. Until a change, yeah, exactly. Until there's a shift. Okay, so let's do some examples. I'll do 2 examples. Okay. Okay. So here I have 2 classic examples that we'll go through to illustrate how I want you to work through these problems. So first, consider the market for bologna, which is an inferior good. Income rises. What happens to PE and QE? So I always say this in macro, and I don't know if your instructor told you this in macro, but the best way to approach these problems is to never use your intuition. Now, is it possible to use intuition for a lot of these? Yeah. Okay. But intuition is often going to stray you incorrectly. You want to use the model. The model is what prevents you from having to use your intuition because it provides a standardized way of looking at these things. Okay. So when I say consider the market for bologna, which is an inferior good, what happens to the equilibrium price and quantity? Okay. What you need to do is you need to draw supply and demand. Now, on an exam or problem set, I would be very explicit about like, okay, draw supply and demand. But here I'm just saying what happens. Okay. Now, when I start with supply and demand, I always do it like this. Okay, that's always my starting point. You should burn that image into your brains. Okay, now I know I go from using PE to using P0. I just do that because I know that the price is going to change. So it's easier for me to start with like a P0 so I can show where P1 is. Now, if you want to label it PE or QE, that's perfectly fine, right? Everything needs to be labeled. As long as the labeling is sensible, then I'm fine, okay? So, baloney's an inferior good and income rises. So what's going to happen to supply and demand here? Exactly, because baloney's an inferior good, income goes up, so demand goes down, okay? So we would draw that by showing, okay, demand is going to shift to the left, oops, like so. It's going to give us D1. That's going to give us a new equilibrium price, P1, a new equilibrium quantity, Q1, and then I like to use arrows to denote all of what is changing. Okay. Now, here's where I am maybe a little annoying about how I want this being done. Because if you notice, the question here is asking what happens to the equilibrium price and quantity. What I just drew was showing my work. It wasn't answering the question. Okay, so to fully answer the question, I would want to say, okay, look, the equilibrium price goes down and the equilibrium quantity goes down. And this would be a perfect, complete answer to the question. Okay? How's that? Oh, okay, for the problem sets. Yeah, I knew you would. I knew you would. Awesome. Sweet. Okay, so let's do this next one then. Consider the market for housing. Both buyers and sellers expect housing prices to rise. What happens to the equilibrium price and quantity? Okay, again, this is always how I start with this graph. Before I even, now let's be honest with ourselves. This left-hand side, you could use your intuition. Should you? No, but you could, okay? This right-hand side, it's going to be a lot harder to use your intuition, right? Because we have multiple things shifting. So if both buyers and sellers expect housing prices to rise, what is going to happen to supply and demand here? So they expect it to happen in the future. So you have it, you just have it flipped.
Yeah, the opposite.
Right, so you see what I mean, Steve? Yep, yep, perfect. Okay, so let me see the chat. Buyers want to buy now, sellers want to wait. That's exactly it, okay? So if you're in the market for a home and you think, okay, home prices are going to rise in the future, what are you going to try and do? I'm going to try and buy right now. So demand is going to shift to the right. Okay. Now, at the same time, sellers do not want to sell right now. They want to wait till the price is higher. So supply is going to shift to the left. Now, this is where it's going to take some practice to get this right, okay? Because when demand shifts to the right, it's going to put upward pressure on the price and the quantity. When supply shifts to the left, it's going to put further upward pressure on the price, and it's going to put downward pressure on the quantity. Okay, so the convention that we use to show this is to show it as if quantity does not change. Okay. However, that visualization of quantity not changing is only the convention for drawing. Okay, that is why it's important that you write the answer to the question. Because here it's undeniable that the price is going to rise, but the quantity is actually uncertain. We do not want to say no change because it's not no change. That would assume that supply and demand shifted by the same amount. But what would happen if, for example, supply shifted by more than demand? Okay, then you would get a situation where the quantity fell. What would happen if demand shifted by more than supply? Okay, Then you would get a situation where the quantity went up. Okay? So whether or not the quantity rises or falls depends on the relative magnitude of the shifts of supply and demand. Without any further information, all that can be said is we don't know about the quantity. Okay?
Sorry, just to clarify. So typically in these situations, does that mean the price wins out over the quantity? So like, would it be the quantity that's typically in question?
Not so it depends on the shifts. Okay, so here it was the case that quantity was uncertain. But if you look back up here at my writing for this, when both supply and demand shift, we can only determine the effect on one of the equilibrium price or quantity. Now, in this example, we could determine the effect on the equilibrium price, but not on the quantity. Now, you could conjure up an example where you can determine the effect on the equilibrium quantity, but not on the equilibrium price. Do you want to
Okay.
see what that would look like?
Yes, please.
Okay. So let me bake up an example here. Okay, so here's another example I just conjured up. Consider the market for apples. Suppose that a new report shows apples are good for your health. At the same time, the number of apple sellers rises. What happens to the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity? Okay, so again, let me ask you guys a question. Should we use our intuition to solve this problem? No. If you do that, you're screwed. Okay, how do you solve this problem? By drawing a graph of supply and demand, identifying what shifts, and then assessing the effect on the equilibrium price and quantity. Okay, so I'm going to start this problem by drawing supply and demand. Before I even think about the problem, okay, haven't even thought about it yet. I just set up the model. We need a foundation for doing this analysis. Now, someone tell me what is going to happen to supply and demand here. Yep, right? Assuming people want to live, demand for apples will go up. So this is what's going to fall under like the taste and preferences thing. Okay, so there's a report that says apples are good for your health. People are going to go buy apples. This is a simple example, but you get what I'm trying to do here. Okay, so demand is going to go up. Is anything else going to happen? So let's look back at supply. Here are the things that shift supply. Look at this one. No, so you are mixing up the difference between quantity supplied and supply. If demand for housing goes up, yes, there are going to be more houses produced. That is an increase in quantity supplied. See? Do you see what I mean, Steve? Yep. That's an extremely good question and a very important point. So when demand goes up, it raises the price. See? Now when the price goes up, that affects quantity supplied. Okay? Firms that make houses are going to want to make more. Okay? Now here, when demand goes up, yeah, it's going to put upward pressure on the price. So apple farmers are going to want to make more apples. But here, there's also going to be more apple farmers, which means that supply is going to shift to the right. Okay? Now, what that is going to do is it's going to make it, okay, so that the quantity undeniably goes up, but the price is uncertain. Okay, so again, this is only by convention that we write this, and it's why it's important to write that the price is uncertain and the quantity goes up, and that would be a complete answer to the question. Okay, I think that this is one of those areas that is ripe for overthinking. Okay, the way that these are done is in look at the prompt, draw supply and demand, identify in the prompt, okay, what is shifting. Here, taste and preferences shifts demand, number of firms shifts supply. Okay, those two things get mapped onto the graph. Okay, and it's part of the reason why understanding the difference between supply and quantity supplied is so important. Okay, because when demand goes up, yes, quantity supplied goes up, but that does not mean supply goes up. So Maria, I think it was you who asked that question. Does that help?
Yes, I do think I'm still overthinking it, but like that's a me problem at this point, and I'll figure it out
Where
later.
does the overthinking come in? So overthinking is by far, without a doubt, the number one thing that I see people struggle with. And that is because, as a lot of you have said in the chat already, which is like, this is obvious. And it is. It's almost so obvious that it causes you to think it's harder than it is. So where does the overthinking come in? Maybe looking at this problem specifically.
Like, so when I'm looking at this, I'm just thinking about how I don't even know really how to put it into words, but I'm like, just I think I'm thinking about too many of the factors that like might change it in like tiny ways and not looking big picture enough. And I need to like simplify it in my brain.
Yeah, I kind of see what you mean. And this is where practice is going to make perfect. I think that with these, the way that I always approach them and the way I always have is in having that list of shifters at your disposal ready to go. Okay, demand, TRIBE. Oh, I forgot to tell you. I forgot to tell you the supply acronym, but you all saw it. It was ROTTEN. ROTTEN. The supply of apples is rotten. Okay. Having a list of the demand shifters, having a list of the supply shifters, then when I give you something that happens, I always do my absolute best because I know that this can get tricky and trick question and overthink territory very quickly. Okay, I do my absolute best to make it abundantly clear what is the determinant that's being affected. Now, in this first example on the left-hand side, I think everybody was extremely clear that I'm talking about income, inferior goods, so nobody had issues with that. On the right-hand side, I'm talking about expectations. Expectations for both buyers and sellers affect both demand and supply. Down here, when I say suppose that apples are good for your health, right, that's not going to affect anything to do with the supply curve. Okay, that is going to affect the demand for apples through taste and preferences. Now, at the same time, the number of apple sellers rises. Okay, clearly that's the number of sellers thing. Okay, so supply is going to increase. right? So I think the best way to avoid overthinking is to try and reconcile the prompt with the list of determinants, okay? And you will see in the problem set exactly what I mean when I say that, because I always make it abundantly clear, what is being affected. Better, Maria?
Yes, thank you. I'll definitely go over more examples that I can find online just so that I can narrow it down to.
Okay, sure. And Steve, I'm pretty sure you said we can use a half sheet of paper for the exam. Yes, you can. And the reason for that is because I don't want there to be any, I don't want somebody to be looking at a problem and they're like, oh shit, I forgot to memorize this one tiny thing, so now I'm screwed. I don't really want that. I don't want the exam to be a memorization exercise. As you can, when you do the problem sets, you're going to know exactly what I mean. Okay. I don't do like questions on the exam where it's like, what is the law of demand and stuff like that. I do more like applying the models, because that's what's more interesting anyways. But yeah, you can use a half sheet of paper. Okay. Any other questions on this? This is super, super important. So I'm happy we stopped to talk about that for a minute. Anything else? Once I do a few, yeah, you will. I promise. Okay. And if you're still overthinking it, then we can talk. Okay, but I promise it'll be fine. Okay. Okay. So we have about 30 minutes left, and I'm going to spend the last 30 minutes introducing what for some of you will be a new topic, and that is consumer and producer surplus. So I know that Greg doesn't do this in his class, in macro at least, but that's why I'm doing it here. Okay. So to motivate this, let's think very simply. What is the goal of a consumer? Okay, the goal of a consumer is simply put to buy at a price that is less than or equal to their willingness to pay. So if I'm willing to pay $5 for a McChicken, my goal as a consumer is to pay a price less than that. And the lower price I pay relative to that $5, the better off I am. We can think of this willingness to pay as a valuation. Okay, so we define consumer surplus as sort of a measure of how successful the consumer is in achieving that goal. Consumer surplus is defined as the difference between the willingness to pay and the price. Okay, so literally you take the willingness to pay and subtract off the price for all units that are purchased. For all units purchased. Okay. Now, this is a way of measuring the net benefits that accrue to consumers in the market. Measures net benefits received by consumers. Now, I mean, that's very simple, right? Basically, suppose that you're willing to pay $5 for a McChicken and you pay $2, then the consumer surplus is 3. 5 minus 2. Okay. Just the extra benefit that you get over top what you paid. All right. So that's why it's the net benefit. Because remember, that willingness to pay is the same thing as the marginal benefit. Okay. So you take the marginal benefit, you subtract off the price, which is, of course, the marginal cost. Right. And if you remember, total benefits minus total cost is net benefit. So that's why I say when we do the marginal analysis stuff on the first day of class, what we're really talking about is consumer surplus. Okay. Now, what we haven't talked about yet is the analogous portion of this for producers. So the goal of a producer is to sell the good at the highest price that they can relative to their willingness to sell. Okay. Now, willingness to sell is effectively the lowest price that a firm would sell the good for. So suppose that McDonald's would sell the McChicken for as little as $1. If they sell it to me for $2, then their surplus is 1. Okay, you see what I mean? So the producer surplus is similarly to consumer surplus, a measure of how successful the producer is in achieving this goal. It is the difference between the price and the willingness to sell. Okay, meaning price minus willingness to sell for all units sold. Okay? And this measures the net benefits received by producers. Okay, how's that idea? Okay, is that pretty good? I think right now it's extremely hand wavy. You kind of need to see this in action before you know what you're supposed to do with this. So let's see what you're supposed to do with it. Apparently, we are going to try and connect these ideas to supply and demand. Okay, so let's see how we can identifying consumer surplus and producer surplus in a market. Okay, so consumer surplus is defined as the willingness to pay minus the price for all units purchased. Now, luckily for us, we have a curve that describes the willingness to pay for every unit that's purchased, and that is called the demand curve. So if you look at a demand curve like this, oh boy, my OneNote is starting to get a little bit laggy here. Okay. If you look at a demand curve and say this is the price, P0, this is the quantity demanded, QD0, okay, then if consumer surplus is the willingness to pay minus price for all units purchased, because the demand curve is, or I should say, represents, the demand curve represents the willingness to pay for a given quantity. That's why I said the demand curve has two interpretations that have value. So for this first unit right here, okay, for this first unit, you were willing to pay, damn it, that's extremely annoying. Okay, there we go. So for this first unit, you were willing to pay this. Okay, what you actually paid was this. So this difference between them is the consumer surplus for that unit. Okay, for the second unit, okay, you were willing to pay this. That's the demand curve. You actually paid this, and so your consumer surplus is that difference right there. So if you do this for every unit that you purchase, for this third unit, you're willing to pay this, and you actually paid this, so it's that difference. Willing to pay this, actually paid that, so it's that difference. If you go all the way down, right, to the number of units that you purchase, that area represents the consumer surplus. Okay, so thus, consumer surplus is the area between the demand curve and the price, the willingness to pay minus the price, up to the number of units purchased. Okay, how's that? Does that make sense? That's super important. Good? All right. So then, producer surplus follows analogous logic. Producer surplus is the price minus the willingness to sell for all units sold. Okay, so luckily we have a curve that describes the willingness to pay, or I should say the willingness to sell for any quantity, and that is the supply curve. Okay, The supply curve is the willingness to sell for any quantity. Okay, in particular, if we draw out that is like completely crooked. Here we go. Oh my God. Let's go. Okay, quantity, price. So if this is the price P0, and this is the quantity supplied QS0, okay, then the supply curve tells us the willingness to pay for any given quantity. So if we want to figure out what the producer's surplus is, we can look at this first quantity 1 here and say, okay, what did we receive for the good? This. What were we willing to receive it for? This. So that distance is the producer's surplus. For the second unit, I received this for it. I was willing to sell it for this. And so that distance is the producer's surplus. And if I repeat this for every unit that I sell, okay, up to the number of units that's sold, then this is the producer's surplus. Okay, so therefore, producer surplus is the area between the price and the supply curve up to the number of units sold. Okay? How's that idea? Good? So being that these are areas, and as you can see, consumer and producer surplus are a triangle, then we can easily figure out the areas of these things by just taking the area of the triangle. Okay, so let's see an example of that. Okay, so let's go back to our example that we've had several times already. If demand is given by this expression and supply is given by this expression, what is CS? What is PS? Okay. Why don't you try that? Okay, so I'll give you a hint. If you look back at what we did earlier with drawing the graph here will be super helpful. So let's go ahead and copy this graph down there. Okay. So consumer surplus is the area between the demand curve and the price up to the number of units that are purchased. So in other words, it's this area right here. This is consumer surplus. And the area of this triangle is the base times the height divided by 2. Here, the base of the triangle is 2. The height of the triangle is 4. So this is 4 times 2 divided by 2, which is 4. So the consumer surplus is 4. Okay. Producer surplus is the area between the price and the supply curve up to the number of units sold. So this area right here, right? So producer surplus is again going to be base times height divided by 2 because it's a triangle. And therefore the base is again 2. The height is again 4. So it's going to be 4 like that. Okay. Good. Super important. So are there any questions about that? Negative. All right, cool. That's good. Now notice this I'm going to say it, but it's if you don't care, cover your ears. But notice that in this example, I abuse language a little bit. I just asked what is consumer surplus, what is producer surplus. To be more precise, I should have said in equilibrium. What is consumer surplus, what is producer surplus? But when you ask it in this way, everybody knows exactly what you're talking about. Okay. I really should have said in equilibrium. Okay. Because that would imply that the price is actually 6. All right. So that's consumer and producer surplus. Then we have total surplus, which is super easy because it's just the sum of consumer and producer surplus. So total surplus TS is the sum of CS and PS. Okay. So up here, you can see that total surplus is 8. Okay. Now, being that consumer surplus measures the net benefits going to consumers, producer surplus measures the net benefits going to producers, right? The total surplus is a measure of the overall net benefits gained from transaction. Measures overall net benefits gained from transaction. Okay. And we actually use this total surplus to measure the efficiency of the market. Measure the efficiency of the market. Okay. Okay. So for the last topic today, let's talk about this efficiency thing. Okay. Let's talk about the efficiency of market equilibrium. Efficiency of market equilibrium. Okay. Now, something to remember, okay? If you remember, I did that whole review of the PPF so that we could remind ourselves of the definitions and the sort of flavor of productive efficiency and allocative efficiency. So I did that because those ideas are going to keep coming back to us. And here's a prime example right here. Now, in general, the precise way that we define efficiency depends on the context. So in the PPF model, we say, okay, look, the economy is productively efficient if it's on the PPF. Well, if we just have a graph of supply and demand, how do we know if it's productively efficient, right? And we say allocative efficiency means you're at the right spot on the PPF. But if we're doing supply and demand, we don't have a PPF, so how are we going to define efficiency? So again, that's why I say that the notion of efficiency is extremely context dependent, okay? You need context to refine your definition of efficiency. So in the context of a market, like we're doing here with supply and demand, we say that a market is efficient. So a market is efficient when it generates the largest possible amount of net benefit to the parties involved. Okay. Now, if you notice, that definition would mean absolutely squat if we were looking at a PPF. It's only when we have supply and demand that we can actually quantify those net benefits. That's why, again, it's context dependent. Okay. Now, this is kind of fancy. It sounds very fancy, but basically, because total surplus is the overall net benefits, basically this means that a market is efficient when it maximizes total surplus. Efficient when it maximizes total surplus. Okay. Now, the specific notion of efficiency that we're referring to here is actually allocative efficiency. This is allocative efficiency. Because we're actually talking about, is the market providing the right amount of good to consumers? Or is it under or over providing the good? So in talking about the right amount of the good being provided by the market, that's where you get into the notion of allocative efficiency. We will come back to productive efficiency in a market when we talk about firms and the nature of firm production and cost. For now, it suffices to say a market is allocatively efficient when it maximizes total surplus. Okay? So here's the important idea with a market, is that markets are efficient at equilibrium. Markets are efficient at equilibrium. Okay. So that is a statement. We kind of need to prove it, or at least we need to justify it in some way. Okay, so why would a market be efficient at equilibrium? Well, apparently that means that in equilibrium, total surplus is maximized. Why? In equilibrium, total surplus is maximized. Okay, let's see why this is the case. All right, so let's start by drawing a market that is in equilibrium. I'm going to try and crunch this down as much as I possibly can. If a market is in equilibrium, then this area is the oops. This area is the consumer surplus. It's so ugly. That's fine. And this area, oops, colors are not changing fast enough. And this area here is the producer surplus. Okay, so let's suppose that the market deviates from equilibrium. Okay, so let's suppose that we get a situation where the price exceeds the equilibrium price. In fact, this is annoying, I know, but what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to move this over. Yeah. I thought I was all going to be able to fit it on one screen, but I'm not. Okay, so soon. Right. Okay, so to show that total surplus is maximized in equilibrium, let's see what happens when we deviate from equilibrium. Okay, so let's start by supposing that we have a situation where the price is above the equilibrium price. We draw the graph of supply and demand. And then we have this being the equilibrium. This being the quantity. Okay, let's suppose that we have a price up here. I'll call it PH for P high. Okay, so if we are in a situation where the price exceeds the equilibrium price, so in this case we have PH that's greater than PE. Okay, now the first thing that we can see is that the quantity demanded is only right here, right? And the quantity supplied is right here. Okay, so there is a surplus of output. Surplus. Okay, so there is a surplus of output. So can everybody see that when I say surplus of output, that is referring to something different than saying like consumer or producer surplus? So the surplus of output is a distance here between quantity supplied and quantity demanded. The consumer and producer surplus are areas. Okay. Now, at this high price that's above equilibrium, let's now find the consumer and producer surplus. Okay, so again, consumer surplus is the area between the demand curve and the price up to the number of units purchased. Okay, so that's consumer surplus. And the producer surplus is the area between the price and the supply curve up to the number of units sold, which in this case is only going to be QD because that's all of the units that are getting purchased anyways. So this is the producer surplus right here. Okay, so you can clearly see here that when we compare the surplus that we achieve in this situation to what we achieve in equilibrium, we've lost this triangle. So some surplus has been lost. So if you compare total surplus in equilibrium that we have above to total surplus in this situation, you can see, notice that some surplus is lost. Okay, and this lost surplus right here, we have a name for it, which is called dead weight loss, DWL. Okay, the lost surplus is called dead weight loss. The lost surplus is called dead weight loss, or DWL. Now, the precise definition of dead weight loss, it's precisely defined as the loss in total surplus, that results when the market deviates from the efficient equilibrium. So here, by deviating from equilibrium, by having a price that's above the equilibrium price, we can see that we lost some surplus, right? In equilibrium, we get this entire triangle, right? At this too high of price, whoa, that's weird. Okay, at this too high of a price here, we only get this trapezoid. Sorry, my OneNote's lagging quite a bit. All right. At this high price here, we only get this trapezoid. So we've lost this triangle. This triangle is called dead weight loss. Now, dead weight loss, because it's a situation where you're losing surplus, what that means is total surplus is no longer maximized, which means dead weight loss is a way of representing the inefficiency of the market. Dead weight loss represents the inefficiency. So when you see a dead weight loss, it should immediately tell you, okay, that market is inefficient. Okay, because we are losing some surplus. We are not maximizing surplus. Okay. Now, if you were to do a price below equilibrium, you would find a similar thing. Okay, so if we had a situation, I'm not going to draw it in the interest of time, especially because next time we're going to see it again with basically that'll be price ceilings. But if you have a situation, right, where the price is lower than PE, then there is a dead weight loss. Okay, so that means if the price is too high, there's a dead weight loss. If the price is too low, there's a dead weight loss. That means the only time that you are not losing surplus is when you are in equilibrium. Okay. Therefore, when the price is equal to the equilibrium price, then there's no dead weight loss, and so you're not losing any surplus. Total surplus is maximized, and so you would say that the market is efficient. Okay. All right, I know I went right up, but that's all I have. Questions? Anyone need me to scroll up and show something again? Anybody? So by now, you should be able to do a good chunk of the problem set. So start working on that. Can you scroll back? Okay, so first question, how to find the problem sets on Canvas. So if you go to Canvas and then go to assignments, you'll see it. Okay, consumer surplus graph, please. And then can you scroll up? So I think that is where Maria needs to see. So, okay, trend's good. So Maria, I think that's the graph that you're looking for. Let me know when you're good, Maria, and then I'll slow up so that Marissa can see right before CS and PS. Okay. And then, is this what you need to see, Marissa, right there? Is there a way how to write an equation? I think you have to kind of make that question more specific, Trent. Go down just a bit. How's that? Like what equation? Is there a way how to write an equation? I don't really know exactly what you're asking.
It's like a supply demand curve, kind of like that, like how you do the equations that you did on the videos that you went over about the like equations and stuff like that. Like
So you mean like this right here?
Similar like that, yes.
Well, these equations for supply and demand are typically given to you.
Okay.
So they're given to you and then you work with them to do stuff. You might shift them, you might solve for stuff, you might identify consumer and producer surplus, but you're not ever, with few exceptions, you're not ever going to really create one of these equations yourself. Although there are problem set questions about numerically shifting these equations, in which case you will have to change them. But yeah, I don't know. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Yep. If you want more examples, these are slope. What do you mean, Maria? Like these are in point slope
yeah,
form?
the equation, how like I wasn't sure if he was asking like how you're converting them, like if he was looking for something specific, like to research further, like it's the slope equation.
Yeah, right. So Trent, were you asking me like how did I go from this line to this line, or were you asking in general about what these equations represent? Or I just want to make sure I got your question answered.
It's just all the equations, how you solve it step by step, something like that.
Okay, well, in these, when it depends on what you're being asked. Okay, so the first thing I could ask you with, say, a demand equation is to graph it. Now, when you graph it, yeah, like Maria said, the best thing to do is to convert it to this point slope form right here, right? So I put price on the left-hand side. Why? Because when I draw my axes like this, I am going to have the price on this axis right here. Okay, so when I rewrite this equation, right, you can see I have QD equals 5 minus P over 2. If I add P over 2 to both sides, subtract QD, and then multiply by 2, I'm going to get that the price is equal to 10 minus 2 QD. So this expression here is the demand curve just written in a different way. Okay. Now, if you are being asked to solve for the equilibrium, that's when you engage this condition that that quantity supplied and quantity demanded have to be equal in equilibrium. Is that better? Okay, let me put it this way. Try the problem sets, try the practice, and see if you run into issues. If you run into issues and you don't know where to go, let me know and we can target it from there. Okay? Okay, cool. Anybody else have any other questions? How was it today? Are you guys liking the style of it so far? Okay. Okay, good. So I'm hoping that you guys enjoy kind of the format of me writing the stuff down with the hopes that you copy it and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, you know what? Let's implement that, because when I have an hour and a half class, I don't feel like doing that. But with a 2 hour class, let's start doing that. So halfway through the class, we'll take 5 minutes and just stop for a second. Okay, that's super valid. I think I confused myself, but that's on me and not you. Well, it would be on me to help you get over that confusion. So I'll try and go over it all and see if it clicks better. Yeah, a little overwhelmed. I think that's entirely possible. And it's also possible that, being that this is review, I'm kind of flying through it. And with that being the case, one thing that you're going to see is that I do, like Steve said, that this is informative. And yeah, I try to give a lot of detail on why things are. But when it comes to solving problems, all of that little minutia isn't entirely important. Okay, I give you that minutia to give you context so that you're more confident in understanding what you're doing. But when you see the problem sets, you'll see that, okay, there's a very clear sort of path to solving these problems. Okay, it just seems to be the case that when you have open-ended, like essay-style problems, that everything is going to be extremely open-ended. But I think that there's a structure that gets followed. It's a lot to take in at first, but the examples helping with practice, I think it'll be better. Yeah, I really hope so. I'm quite sure that, Jillian, let me know what you want me to see exactly. I'm certain that once you start to see the examples in action on the problem sets, then you'll be like, okay, so this is exactly what he wants us to be able to do from a specific thing. But yeah, I mean, let me know how those problem sets go. Get started on them early, and then we can kind of target any issues you guys are having. Any other suggestions? I like Steve's suggestion to take a 5-minute break. So we'll start doing that. Jalen, am I showing you what you want to see? I kind of just picked a random spot here. Market equilibrium. Thank you. I think I've, okay, awesome. Thanks, Jalen. All right, you guys. I'll see you in a couple days.